I want to share some thoughts today with you from Psalm 3. Psalm 3 was written by David at a time in his life when life seemed to be falling apart. In 2 Samuel 11, we read where David probably made the worst mistake of his life when he committed the sin of adultery with Bathsheba. And although David repented when he was confronted by the prophet Nathan, the consequences of his actions are spelled out as the Lord speaks through Nathan to David in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 11, where it says, "This is what the Lord says, because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you." And from here, David's problems escalated to the point that his son Absalom led a rebellion against King David in order to take over the throne so that Absalom could become king. So David's life seemed to be falling apart. You know, few of us have gone through anything close to the trauma that David was experiencing here. But in some ways, you've probably had times when you could identify with David. Events and situations take place, and it seems that life is falling apart. You may be experiencing a situation right now, and it seems that life is falling apart. As we continue to navigate the uncharted waters of COVID-19 and the challenges that we all have faced recently, you know, there's some who may be tempted to believe that life is falling apart. So what do you do when life falls apart? What do you do? And this is what I want to talk about today. And this is what Psalm 3 is about. Psalm 3 is titled, "A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son." As I said earlier, David wrote this psalm when his life seemed to be falling apart. And there is a principle here in Psalm 3 that we can use when our life seems to be falling apart. But let's start by reading verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 3. "Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God." The tone here in these verses is that David's life is falling apart. He says, there's so many against me, Lord, and my enemies, they're saying that there's no help for me in God. And some of you may be feeling that way today. You may be thinking that there's no help for you in God. However, David used the principle of declaration that we see in the next verse to counter the thinking that there was no help for him in God. And the first declaration that David used was, "But God." But God. David writes in verse 3, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head." Here David says, "But you, O Lord," or "but God." And this caused a shift from focusing on his circumstances to focusing on the Lord. And as our life seems to be falling apart, we can stop and declare, "But God." And that causes a shift from us focusing on our circumstances to focusing on the Lord. And after David declared, "But God," this led to a series of declarations. When David began to focus on the Lord instead of his circumstances, this caused him to begin making declarations about who he believed God to be. Verse 3 again, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me." David declared that he believed that the Lord was his shield. A shield is for protection and for defense. And we can declare that the Lord is our shield, or our protector, or our defender. And then David declared that God was the one who lifts up my head. To lift up the head is a Hebrew expression for restoring someone to his dignity and position who has been cast down. We read in Genesis 40, verse 13, when Joseph told the cupbearer, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. David here in Psalm 3 was declaring that God was the one who could restore the dignity and the position that he had before the crisis that caused his life to fall apart. And we can declare the same, that God is the one who lifts up my head. Then we read in verse 4, where David made another declaration. He says, I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. David declared here that God heard him when he cried out to him, or he called out to God. David believed God to be the one who answered his prayers. The Lord hears us when we call out to him, and the Lord hears our prayers. One commentator observes here in Psalm 3 that when David cried out to the Lord with his voice, he was not expressing just a one-time act of calling out to God, but he was expressing actually the habit of a life. David had a lifestyle of prayer, of calling out to God. And prayer needs to be a major part of our lifestyle. And no matter where we're at or in what kind of difficult circumstances we find ourselves, even if our difficulties are the result of our own sin or failure, we can cry out to the Lord and declare that he will hear and answer our prayers. Prayer needs to be a major part of our lifestyle. And then what happened? We read in verse 5, David writes, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. David cried out to God, and then he went to sleep. He went to bed. He had peace in the midst of his circumstances. He had learned to be anxious for nothing. And that's what happens when we believe God to be the one who answers our prayers. We can go to sleep and be at peace. And David also said, he said, I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. And we can also be anxious for nothing in the midst of our circumstances, because we can declare that the Lord sustains us. This word sustained, it means to support, to uphold. That's another great declaration about God. He upholds us. Now, remember in verse 2, David wrote, Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. But now, as we get ready to read in verse 6, the Lord did help David by delivering him from a spirit of fear. Let's read verse 6. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. The Lord had delivered David from a spirit of fear in the midst of the terrible circumstances that he was in. From a sermon by Jimmy Evans here recently, Jimmy made a statement regarding fear. He said, Fear is a prophet spirit from hell sent to give us a negative report about the future that will upset us and cause us to make a fear-based decision that God will not honor. You see, David did not believe the negative report in verse 2, where it said many are they who say of me, there's no help for him in God. And because of the sustaining presence of the Lord, David made the decision that he would not be afraid in this seemingly life falling apart situation. And we can make that same decision to not be afraid of any negative report of the future, because we know that the presence of the Lord is with us to sustain us and to uphold us. Now, I just want to make two more comments on verses 7 and 8 as I close. Verse 7. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. See, David here pictures his enemies as these hungry beasts and they're baring their teeth and they're getting ready to devour him. So David asks God to break their teeth, which would make them powerless. And we can ask God to break the teeth of our enemy, because that breaks the power of whatever may be causing our life to fall apart. And then in verse 8, David writes, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. David's final declaration, salvation belongs to the Lord, shows that David was not depending on his troops or his counselors that he had planted to mislead Absalom, or any military strategy. He had all these things at his disposal, and he did use them. But in the end, he acknowledges that any victory would come from God alone. So, as you face times when it seems like life is falling apart in the days ahead, shift from focusing on your circumstances to focusing on the Lord, declaring, but God. And then follow that by making other declarations about who you believe God to be. The Lord is my shield. The Lord is the one who lifts up my head. The Lord is the one who answers my prayers. The Lord is the one who sustains me. The Lord is the one who delivers me from a spirit of fear. The Lord is the one who breaks the teeth of my enemies. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So bless you in the days and weeks ahead. And remember, but God.